Today I'm here with Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke. Scott, it's good to see you. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I am from Oakley, Idaho. In real life, I'm a cattle rancher, and but I've been in the state legislature. I was in the state legislature for 20 years before I became the lieutenant governor. The last 10 of which I served as the Speaker of the House. It was a great run, great experience, and ran statewide in 2022, and was and here I am. Everyone always asks me, well, how did you get into politics? And the answer is because I am a public lands rancher. I ranch on your land, Greg. And so that is always, federal land grazing always has a political component to it because the underlying philosophies, if you will, well, let's just put it this way. No never means no for more than 4 years. Yes never means yes for more than 4 years. Every new administration brings a distinctly different twist to the underpinnings of our industry. And so that is always, and I'm a fourth generation cattle rancher. And so if there is to be a fifth and a sixth, et cetera, then there needs to be, you've got to be politically involved. My involvement to begin with was always at the federal level because that's where the public land grazing policy is set. Now they interface with us out here in Idaho, but if you want to move the needle policy-wise, it's in Washington, D.C. In fact, it was in that setting that I first met Brad Little. He's a public land rancher in his former life. So before either one of us were elected, we were working public land issues, basically because for continuity of our livestock operations. So that's how I got into politics. That's kind of what makes me tick. I'm happily married to Sarah for 45 years. We have 4 children, 16 grandchildren, all of that. I'll check all of those logistics boxes, with all of which live in Idaho. And that's really important to us. It's important to me that they have access to a great state like we have always had here since the Bedkes came to Idaho before it was Idaho. And we love it here. It's where we live. And we feel some obligation to make it better than we found it.
There's a lot of talk about multi-generation Idahoans versus people who just moved here. I really appreciate the experience that comes from those who have been here for multi-generations who, really are caretakers of the land.
What should we expect, Greg? I mean, we've spent decades laying the foundation for a good state, an unobtrusive and not intrusive state, least the smallest footprint of government that we possibly can create. We've done it right. We've been careful with policy. We've been careful with taxpayer monies, and we've done that for decades. And now we've been discovered, and everybody wants what we have been able to take for granted for a long time. So we can't blame anybody for wanting to move here, but we will blame them if they change it.
With all these new people moving in, that of course means more growth, which means more water use. So today I wanted to discuss water management, water rights. Could you give us a brief primer on how our Idaho water laws and rights work?
Well, I've been asked this a lot. And so I always ask the audience if any of them have children. And most of the people in the audience raise their hand. If they don't raise their hand, I ask them if they are a child and have siblings. And then most of the hands are now up in the audience. And then I ask them if they have ever heard, that's mine, I had it first. And that is the concept of prior appropriation. So in the West, particularly in the West, the water laws evolved around that concept. Whoever was here first in time is first in right. Now that's called the prior appropriation doctrine, and it evolved from the mining laws, but it is enshrined in Idaho's constitution. It's baked into all of our statutes. It's how we allocate scarce resource, the scarce resource called water here in Idaho. I also use an example of what it really means, because prior appropriation is very, very harsh. The juniors, those that came after, are not entitled to the water until those that came first get their allotment. And so, if first in time is first in right. And so if a senior is not getting their water, it doesn't matter if it's because of Mother Nature, it doesn't matter for whatever reason, the juniors shut off until the seniors get their legal amount. All right. So that is very, very harsh. It's unpredictable. The financial institutions hate the swings, the ups, the downs. And so you can round off the rough edges of prior appropriation with mitigation plans. What is a mitigation plan? Well, it's a list of things that juniors agreed to do in the water system that make the whole system better for everyone. And as long as, so the juniors have to sign off on it, obviously, the seniors have to sign off on it. And then that mitigation plan becomes filed with the state government, with the Department of Water Resources, and becomes part of the water right. That the harshness of prior appropriation does not kick in as long as the points of the foundation and the mitigation plan, the list, if you will, if that has been checked off, then that's how you proceed. And so you can modify the harshness, if you will, of prior appropriation through a mitigation plan. Let's take that in one more step. I think this is really important that everyone understands. Let's say that there was a beautiful valley that the Graf family came to in Idaho 140 years ago, and they settled in this valley, and it had a beautiful stream that ran down through it. The upper part of the valley was obviously higher than the lower. So the Grafs settled in the lower part of the valley on the stream. They began farming, ranching, set up shop, set up a homestead there. And they were the undisputably first family in the valley. And then let's say that the Bedkes came 120 years ago. They came and settled in the upper part of the valley, in the same part as, in the same valley as the Grafs. Now, the Bedkes knew that the Grafs were senior to the Bedkes, and that in a time of shortage, the Bedkes would have to forego water use until the Grafs' water right was satisfied. But and that worked really good, probably 9 out of 10 years, 8 out of 10 years, there was no problem. There was plenty for everybody. We got along just fine. We became friends. We created a community. Maybe our kids got married, whatever. But so we created a community in that valley, but the underpinnings were on a senior and a junior. All right. And so, and as long, because of the harshness of shutting off the Bedkes, then the Grafs and the Bedkes got together and they said, there's some things that we could do in this valley that would make it better for everybody. But since you're the juniors, Bedkes, then you're probably going to have to shoulder most of the burden. And of course, the Bedkes knew that, and they were agreed to it, and we created a list. It doesn't matter what's on the list. The list made it better for everybody. And as long as the list was completed, then nobody ever got shut off. We all agreed to live within the mitigation plan. And then time passes again, and the Bedkes start cutting corners. And the Grafs are patient people, but at a certain point, they said enough is enough. And so now the mitigation plan blows up, and we're back to the prior appropriation. Keep in mind that all this happened before Idaho was a state, but as soon as it became a state, we went and did what all good citizens do. We filed our water rights and perfected those water rights with the state of Idaho at the department. They granted us a property right based on this priority system, and also tempered by the mitigation plan. But the mitigation plan had an asterisk by it that said, hey, if you don't do it, we revert back to the underpinning of the water right. And so that's kind of how, and so you can take that example. I'll stop using it right now, but you can take that example 100 different directions. And so mitigation plans are created to round off and to ameliorate the harshness of prior appropriation because it is so disruptive. Either get enough or nothing until the seniors are satisfied. So that's the underpinnings of the water law in Idaho. It's first in time, it's first in right, but it's hard to create and sustain communities around that. And so people start working together and creating these systems that you still have to follow, because if you don't have water here and in the agricultural sector, particularly in Idaho, you don't have a livelihood. And so it's very emotional because everyone's livelihood is at stake. And so everybody is always keyed up when we talk about water or we change things, or frankly, we end up stress testing these mitigation plans. And things that we thought would work don't work. If you have 2 or 3 dry years in a row, then it puts a lot of stress on it. And so you sit down. In the perfect world, you make note of all that. You sit down and you redraft the mitigation plan to take into account every foreseeable situation. But you always miss something, and times change, and so the mitigation plan tends to be evolving, but you can't do it unilaterally. Just because the juniors aren't happy, you can't change the mitigation plan. Both the juniors and the seniors have to be okay with it, and then keep in mind that you have to take the mitigation plan to the court, as it were, and the court has to bless it as being hydrologically sustainable, significant, etc. I think there's another thing we got to remember in a water law in Idaho is that we manage our water resources as if they were sustainable and make them available for the next generation. I think the best example of that is how we manage our state forests. We don't let this generation of Idahoans over-harvest the forest. We want there to be timber and timber receipts for the next generation, so this generation can't take more out of the forest than its fair share. And you do that through careful management of the forest. But the underpinning concept is that this generation can't take more than its share. That same principle applies to water and our aquifer system in the state. It also applies to your savings and checking account. You can't take more out of it than you put into it. Or you can augment your savings account or your checking account with your savings account, but that savings runs out, and then you have to live on what your inflows have to match your outflows ultimately, and that's where, and that's another underpinning principle for water management here is that we can't use more than comes in. Now,
Well,
there are things that we can do to augment what comes into the aquifer, et cetera, but the checkbook has got to balance.
Exactly. We're not the federal government. We can't print more water. There's a lot of information out there. Sometimes I see things that are confusing, a little misinformation. Some people who are talking about water like you really understand the subject better than most because you live it. So I guess one of the things is understanding the differences between ground, surface, natural flow, storage. Like there's different types of water, not just the stuff that falls from the sky or what's sitting in the rivers. Can you just briefly describe the differences there and how that's managed?
And this is kind of where it gets a little more complicated. Keeping in mind all those principles we talked about, we have the surface water system, which is that stream in our early example. That's water that just is on the surface. We can go get wet in it. We can measure it. We can put it through a system of weirs and measure exactly how many cubic feet per second we have, etc. But it turns out that stream in our example is fed by underground sources. They're at the head of the valley. There are springs that are coming out of the mountain or out of the foothills there that make up this stream. And so if the Bedkes in our previous example, even though I said I wasn't going to use it anymore, but if the Bedkes went to the top of the valley and not only used the surface water that was there, but started drilling wells and and tapping into the water that would have flown into the stream, then that puts pressure on the amount of water that is in the stream. So that's the system that we have. We have, an aquifer system that is hydrologically connected to the surface system, but it was not recognized as being hydrologically connected until the 1990s. That was when it was put into law. And that's when the conjunctive management rules started coming into play, because in the real world example, most of Twin Falls Canal Company's water comes into the Snake River at the Blackfoot bottoms there around Fort Hall. And so if there's a lot of groundwater use in the Eastern Idaho, then that lessens the amount of water that flows back into the river. And that's what the rub is. And so the conjunctive management rules were put into place in the 1990s. And then there's a third type of water in Idaho, and that's storage water. And that doesn't necessarily, that is water that is more of a straight up personal property right. The entities invested in the dams, and the storage water behind the dam is not first in time, first in right. It's not in priority. Now we have rules that say that you can't hoard the water. You can only have reasonable carryover. So at the end of the year, you're not entitled. You're entitled to a reasonable amount of carryover to satisfy your storage right for the next year. But it's not first in time is first in right. The storage water was always meant to augment the surface water or the natural flow water rights. They can also be leased and used to augment the groundwater usage as well. But that would be basically the third type of water, is the natural flow in the streams, the aquifer water, and then the storage water. And each one has a little different statutory structure behind it. The natural flow and the aquifer are connected through the conjunctive management rules. And so the seniors of the surface system can call out the juniors in the aquifer system because of the conjunctive nature or the hydrological connection. And so that those would be your three broad categories, I guess. So anyway, so the conjunctive management, of course, complicates everything because, Idaho back in the day, we flood irrigated, and everyone in the Eastern Idaho flood irrigated, and they put more water on the crops and the crops could use, and that water ran off and went and seeped into the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. So the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer rose to an unnatural level, about peaking in the 1950s, early 60s. And it was at that time, of course, then technology is happening. We're starting to discover that we can drill wells, deep wells, and that we can bring that water to the surface and irrigate crops. And Idaho and its policymakers love that. Our utilities love that because we're buying electricity. And there's this go, 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 expand, expand, expand mentality all through, for decades, certainly through the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. And we use that groundwater resource as if it were an infinite resource. But it was the mound, if you will, in the aquifer, the overage in the aquifer that was a result of the previous 100 years of inefficient irrigation, or at least inefficient by today's standards. And so there started to be clouds, if you will, on the horizon, and certainly in the late 70s, the 80s, they're going, whoa, this is not an inexhaustible supply of water. We got to start putting the brakes on. We can't keep bringing in new farmland, etc. But for all of those years, there was no differential between being a senior and a junior. There was enough for everybody, and the prior appropriation never had to be used, certainly not globally. And but then, we start showing signs that this is not an inexhaustible supply. You have to start putting the brakes on. Again, the connectivity was recognized scientifically. And so in the 90s, the conjunctive management rules started coming in. We started not letting people drill new wells, except for homesteads, except for just houses. And we started recognizing that we had a finite resource and that it was going to need to be managed. Going back to the example of the checkbook, the checking account and the savings account, is that we couldn't continue to augment our checking account because the money in our savings account was not inexhaustible. So the same thing was happening with the water, and now friction starts happening. Idaho Power Company uses hydropower, and Les was coming down their systems to create power. They wanted, which they recognized they were at the back of the line, but they had made this commitment to Idaho to always supply power, and they couldn't lean on the river to do that. So they proposed a coal fire plant back in the day in the Jerome area. And Southern Idaho said, no, we're not going to have coal fire plants here. And Idaho Power said, well, what are you going to do there? Anyway, all of that, long story short, triggered the statewide adjudication, or the Snake River Basin adjudication, where everyone, the rights that they were entitled to were blessed by the court. So everybody brought what they'd been using, made their case in front of the adjudication court, and had their rights adjudicated. So we had a starting point so that you could manage all of this water. And the state policymakers, of course, our economy is heavily reliant on agriculture and food processing and whatnot. So every time we made any movements in this area where there was give, there had to be take, because it is a zero-sum game. And so it set up the landscape, I guess, for a lot of the conflict that we're having now.
You bring up a really good point as far as the give and take. Is it requires compromise in order for the parties to come together and come to a solution. Right. When was this first? Was it in 2016 when there was the settlement agreement? When did all this come
about? You started having lawsuits filed in the late 90s, early 2000s. The main lawsuit was filed by Twin Falls Canal Company, or a water call, in 2005. And they went to the courts, and the court said, yes, there are senior water rights here that look to be injured by junior water right activity or junior pumping activity. But the connectivity between the two rides is, there's not this cause and effect. There's not black and white. And so the courts kind of deferred making final judgments for approximately 10 years there, certainly 8 or 9. And we sued each other. And all of these cases went to the Idaho Supreme Court. So consequently, by 2012, 13, 14, 15, there was very little gray area left in Idaho water law. The courts, the Supreme Court had spoken as to all of these different permutations that we can think of just here. And so including a court-ordered method for determining injury. So, yeah, seniors, you're entitled to redress, but that has to be quantified. And the way for determining that injury was set about by the court. The methodology orders, you'll hear that. Then those methodology orders changed over time as well. And so the final methodology orders of the day were issued in 2015, I believe, and which basically said that if you're the senior water right holder, in order to protect your property right, then if it's being injured, then the parties doing the injury have to shut off immediately so that you get your water overnight. You have to do those things that get the water to the seniors immediately. Now, that's pretty harsh. And not only are we going to check in April, but we're also going to check in May, we're going to check in July, and we're going to check in September. So the injury determination that we come up with at the, on the 20th of May may not be the same one we're going to get on the 11th of July, which may all be different than one in September. But the court was blind to that, and so they said it doesn't matter if it was okay in May, but it's not in July. You're going to shut off until it is okay in July, and that is very disruptive when you have a crop in the ground, and so. But that was the way it was. The Supreme Court backed it up. And so that forced the parties, mostly reluctantly, to come to the table and to create mitigation plans that took into account the methodology orders. Now, the first one that I got involved in and helped facilitate and mediate was the order or the methodology plan from 2016, because that was an exceptionally dry year. 2015 was dry. And when you run the scenarios of what it would look like with the new methodology, it would be completely devastating to the ag economy. And so there's a lot of pressure for everybody to come together. The good news is that we have enough water. Even in those dry years, water went out of the Snake system and into the Columbia, et cetera. And we still had to live up to the Nez Perce Agreement, which was basically that we got to send water down the country for fish flush. And so there was water, but it was a timing issue and a location issue. And so we started so we came up with a mitigation plan that we thought would work. It was our best efforts in 2015. It worked in 2016 because it was an average water year. 2017 was Snowmageddon, remember that? And the aftermath of Snowmageddon in the system got you through 2018. 2019 was average again. 2020 started being dry. 21 was dry. 22 was dry. And it stress tested the mitigation plan of 2015, and it wasn't working for enough people, and they walked away from it, which triggered the crisis in 2024, where that everyone remembers, and so we came up with a 1-year mitigation plan to get through 2024, and then spent most of that year drafting the 2025 plan that we're under now, so that we could, and we put into the 2025 plan everything that we learned from our 2015 experience. And we have it, and it seems to be working. It worked well last year. Of course, this year's different conditions, but what is one of the main differences between 2015 and 2025 mitigation plans is that the 2015 was an annual plan. There's a lot of differences, but one of the main things was that was a year-to-year deal. This is 4-year. The 2015 or 2025 is a 4-year block. So, because there's no such thing as average, but you start getting averages when you start having longer time periods. So you get a 4-year allocation of water, and that can accommodate individual cropping rotations and weather patterns, et cetera. And we're in the middle of, or to the end of year 2 in this new plan. So that's what's going on right now. I think another thing, probably some of your listeners will be interested in, another thing that they did in 2024 was the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. The line on the map was just an arbitrary line, a political line in many cases, followed highways, followed county lines, it was not hydrologically driven. And so all of the tributary basins to the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer were hydrologically connected, yet they were outside of the mitigation plan, outside of they were unaffected, yet their activities directly affected the amount that was going into the Eastern Snake Plain. And so the legislature allowed, I guess, for the map, for the lines to be drawn in. So we started doing water management from mountaintop to mountaintop, just not in the valleys based on a line that somebody drew way back when. Now, there was more science to it than that, but it did not include all of the hydrologically connected geography.
Let's talk about the 2024 curtailment. And a lot of people saw the news coming out of East Idaho about the red tags put on the pumps and all this. There was a lot of, I wouldn't say drama, but there was a lot of issues and people were upset. And I guess what were those negotiations like? How many people were involved and what setbacks were overcome?
Yeah, you say drama, I say emotion, but I also say everyone's livelihood was on the line, and that brings out, and so you get everyone's attention in a hurry. I mean, we were looking, if everybody just had walked away from it, and we'd gone back to the harsh realities of prior appropriation, we'd have turned off hundreds of thousands of acres of productive Idaho farmland, and no one wanted that. Certainly the policymakers, no one in the state wanted that, because ag in southern Idaho is such a huge driver to our whole state's economy. All right, so there's that. So you had but the mitigation plan wasn't working. Keep in mind that the acres irrigated by surface systems are about 1/3 of the total. The land irrigated by the groundwater sources is approximately 2/3 of the total. And so you had maybe, and I mean no disrespect, I was in the middle of all of this. I'm kind of a hands-on negotiator or mediator. I mean, so you had a too big to fail mentality. And then you had the other mentality is that we're seniors, period, and entitled to our water. And that was very controversial. But in quiet moments, these conversations happened. The seniors came to me and they said, we don't want to put anybody out of business here. We understand that we have a location and a timing problem. We didn't get to this problem overnight. We're not going to fix it overnight. We just need to be moving in the right direction. And, and that best typified the sentiment across, or the general sentiment in the surface water community. Now there were outliers in those negotiations that were very strident. But across the board, I described kind of where they landed is that we don't want to put our neighbors out of business, so we'll work with them. It's got to be hydrologically significant. It's got to be hydrologically defensible, but we'll work with everyone. And the juniors would pull me aside and they'd say, our activities, our wells are going down. And, I'm a 3rd generation farmer. I'm a 4th generation farmer. I want there to be something for my kids and grandkids. And so what our use patterns are not sustainable over decades. And so we've got to do something. We realize that we've got to do something. And oh, by the way, state, you're the ones that encouraged us to do this in the first place. So we're going to need your help. And so from a mediator's perspective, you had overlap in the two positions. Both understood we had a common problem. Neither wanted to put each other out of business. These are farmers that they're very homogeneous. They understand each other's lives and each other's problems. And so I agreed to come in and help mediate. Back in 2015, we mediated that one. And then this one, I was greatly assisted this time by Jeff Rabel, the chair of the Water Resource Board. And anyway, that was the parties. But, a kind of a cool thing happened, Greg, in those meetings. And there were 30, 40 people in all of these meetings. It's hard to do anything with that many people in a meeting. I got to the point where, in the first few meetings, this was just a venue for airing grievances and past grievances. And they were, these were rancorous meetings. They were hot and emotional type meetings. And we had a lot of lawyers in the room that in my opinion, kept things stirred up. And so we went down that path for a couple of months, and And so we basically just kicked the lawyers out of the room. Said we got to have the farmers, we got to talk to the farmers here and come to the principles that they can agree on. You know, there will be a time to capture these agreements in a contract. We're going to need lawyers to do that because this will be legally binding. But it's not now. As we're noodling these ideas and everything, we don't need them shot down right out of the gate. We're going to come up with some concepts, and then when the farmers can agree conceptually, then we'll bring the lawyers in to draft it and to ask all the what if questions and start poking holes in the concepts. And that happened. But the first few meetings, like say first couple of months, you could characterize as airing grievances. They started getting constructive early in the summer. The governor, tongue in cheek, wanted this to be done by the 1st of July. That didn't happen. By the November 14th, we were able to have a document that all of the groundwater districts signed and all of the surface water districts are signed. And then it was approved by the states. And so it took us all year long in 2024 to get to where we are right now. And we'll see. As long as people keep talking to each other and bringing the issues up and not letting them fester, then this plan is going to modify as well too, because as smart as we think we are in 2024, we missed something. I don't know what it is yet, but we missed something. And we're going to have to make changes in the way we operate. Again, going back to our original example, we're trying to keep peace in the valley. It's a better way to run a community when there's this give and take, compromise, if you will, because we all share a major resource here. And on looking back, Greg, I have to think, most of the issues that we fight about politically are these types of issues. The good thing about last summer was that I never heard the word Democrat once. I never heard the word Republican once. We didn't talk about liberals. We didn't talk about conservatives. We just talked about a common problem. And when everybody realized that they were stuck with each other, then they rolled up their sleeves and we gave it our best shot of fixing the common problem. And so many times, there's not necessarily a partisan way to do most of the things that a state needs to do. We have limited resources, and we try to allocate those resources as best we can when we're building roads or infrastructure or building schools or buying desks for schools or all of the things that a state does. And so once that room kind of reconciled with the fact that they were stuck with each other. Nobody was going to vote anybody off the island, that they were all stuck with each other. Then the magic started to happen. But the magic is not going to be perfect. And part of the things they all agreed to was if things start coming up, they got to bring it up. If it's not working for one side, then it's not working for both sides, because that's right, we're stuck with each other. So anyway, we were able to see the best in everybody. We were also able to see the worst in the individuals, but everybody took their turn on that spectrum. And I thought, in retrospect, I don't want to do it again soon. I will if I have to. But anyways, that's another. Jeff and I started. We told everybody that we come from work ethic backgrounds, and so we told everybody that to bring a sack lunch and a flashlight, because we were going to be out until the job was done, and so we weren't going to quit them, and they didn't get they couldn't quit us, and so we ground it out, and it took us most all year.
On the new agreement, what would you say are the differences between the 2016 one and the 2024? And how does that work? For instance, if there's dry years or worse, multiple dry years.
So in order to, we have to come up with an amount, everybody is entitled to an amount. I mean, the natural system is still working. The aquifer water is coming into the aquifer every year. And so we need to know what, so in a forest, you need to know what the growth increment is. So you just harvest the growth increment and you don't harvest the base, if you will. And so we don't want to manage the aquifer as if it were an oil or gas deposit, because then you just pump it until it's gone and move on to the next one. That's not how we want to do the aquifer. And so you have to come out with an amount that is available every year. And then based on the acres, you allocate each one of the groundwater districts how much of that increment they can have. And that took a lot of bringing scientists in the room and modeling and bringing everybody up to speed on how all that works so that they could sign off on their allocation. But I think a major difference between the 25 one and when compared to the 2015 one was that we did that increment in 4-year blocks, because there's no such thing again as an average year. And so there's swings in with the water years, but you start leveling out those ups and downs the longer the time schedule or cycle that you look at. So we went to 4-year increments. In the 2015 agreement, then the whole groundwater district had to live up to its obligation, or everybody in the groundwater district was penalized. So think of a football team at practice. The offensive tackle jumps off sides, and then the whole team runs laps because of the one bad actor. In the 2025 agreement, everyone is accountable for their own actions down to the farm. And so, there are penalties, and everyone has agreed to use their allocation. But your actions as my neighbor are not going to help or hurt me. And I have to live up to my part of the agreement as you have to live up to yours. And if you don't, you get consequences and I don't, and vice versa. So that was a major change in the way it was done. Another major change was there's a way to augment these allocations by recharge and managed recharge. See, every spring we have this extra water. If we could get that down into the aquifer, then that's more than we can use more than our underpinning allotment, because that's part of the increment. And so all recharge was not created equal. So putting water in the ground in Gooding didn't help anything above American Falls. And so we refined the way the managed recharge program was going to work, and we allowed the private entities, groundwater districts, to do recharge themselves and get credit for that. And so that was a major change. So we put structure around the managed recharge. We all agreed none of this works if we aren't measuring. So everybody needs to know exactly how much is being used all the time, and that has got to be reported to a central dashboard so that we can see where we are against our allotments all the time. And so that you're not, see, the way it used to be, you didn't know that you'd overpumped in 2021 until May of 22, when the next crop was in the ground. So, I mean, that lag in information gathering really made it hard to manage. We moved everything up. Technology exists to be able to do measurements in real time, down to every 10-minute increments, intervals if you'd like, but certainly every week, so you know where you are against. I mean, when you drive across the state, if you drive back up to Idaho Falls, you're going to check your gas gauge a bunch of times on that trip. And, so you just know how much you have left. And so it's a similar thing we're going to measure. And then there's got to be consequences if to the ones that choose not to comply. We're all in this together. And we use the broken street light example. If you don't fix the first broken street light, then the whole neighborhood eventually can go downhill. And so if we're going to do this, then everybody's got to do it. And And if you don't, but you don't have to be in a mitigation plan if you don't want to be, but you roll the dice every year. And, and if you come up a winner, then great. And if it's dry year, then you suffer those consequences and have to shut off maybe mid-season. And so, we just put structure around these common sense concepts that I've described, and it seems to be working.
Can you tell me a little bit about the tributary basin inclusion and how that came to be a bill passed by the legislature and signed by the governor?
Well, again, the Eastern Snake Plain boundaries were not driven or were not drawn on maps based on strict hydrology. They were but as we collected more and more data, it became increasingly apparent that everything was hydrologically connected and that activities on one side of the line affected the water supplies on the inside of the line. And so these tributary basins were hydrologically connected. They'd never been managed before. But in the whole. But again, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. And if we're all hydrologically connected, then that's what the legislature did, was redraw the lines, as it were, so that everything that was hydrologically connected was managed to the whole. It was not fair to the ones inside the line to make all of the arrangements, all the adjustments necessary to compensate for activities that were happening on outside of the line, and that everybody needed to do their fair share. Now, that means we have to rely on the science. That means we have to rely on the modeling and how the connectivity of this system that is not tangible. We can't see it, we can't feel it, but we can measure it and collect data so we know within parameters what it is doing. And, so bringing them in was thought to be fair to everyone, but that transition, if I'm in the tributary basin, that transition from not being managed to being managed is a thing.
What are your worries about the long-term viability of the new agreement, and what are your confidences in it?
Well, I mean, it's going to have to be adaptable, and we'll get set in our ways, and we'll be reluctant to adapt because we'll become accustomed to the system, and we'll think that it's always going to be like this. And anyway, so just that reluctance to adapt to new data is a worry. Our propensity is as human beings to not, to tend to not communicate and to put, if their problems start, we don't talk about them immediately. And if we do talk about them immediately, sometimes the other party dismisses our concerns. And so that communication flow is absolutely necessary for this to work, and then to adapt based on changing data. So that concerns me. We live in the arid West, and we got to come to grips with that. And we're in one of the fastest growing states in the nation. And just because we are doesn't mean we're going to get more water in our river systems. But the good news is it is a timing and location problem. In 2024, in the middle of all of the problems, approximately 700,000 acre feet left the system. 700,000 acre feet. We could, if we'd have had that diverted into the aquifer some way. Now it is impossible to dig a big enough hole to take that amount of water and put it in the aquifer. So there are logistical problems. You need 700 holes, just one hole to put all of those things in. So that was the major thing that the legislature did this session, was step up and allocate ongoing money to put that water back into the aquifer. So the ongoing component of that is a concern to me, because as our state becomes more urbanized or suburbanized, then we remove people farther away from the underpinnings of agriculture. And so there's always this effort to keep everyone educated on the water problems, and they don't directly affect them. They're always indirectly affected, and so that's a concern. I, I guess if we get those things fixed, then I won't be all that concerned. But we got to talk to each other. We got to continue to collect data. Our mitigation plan has got to be adaptable. And we've got to make investments back into our own future by putting this water back into the ground. Now, and build surface systems. We got to seriously consider rebuilding the Teton Dam and other dams. We don't have the luxury of not doing that. The Nez Perce agreement that requires Idaho to send 487,000 acre feet of water down, to flush fish. When all of the stakeholders agree that that's not helping the fish, we've got to, that's on our horizon, and that's got to be renegotiated. But we can't wait for that to happen. We can't wait for the Teton Dam to be built. If we had green lights starting right now, we'd still be, insert your big number here. How many years is it going to take to put that back in? 15 plus. We'll dry up and blow away before then. So we got to be doing things, interim things, short-term things all the time. And those are my concerns.
Quick question on the Teton Dam, since you brought that up. Where was that at, the status of that? I noticed there's been a lot of discussion about it. This is the first year I've heard about discussions about there being a new Teton Dam.
Obviously, it was up above Rexburg there. And it failed in 1976, I think. So, but keep in mind that the day that the Teton Dam was full, it only held 275,000 acre feet of water. And every year we send 200,000 acre feet of water out of the same system to flush fish. So that is stored behind other dams. So there are some things that we can do there. But people are starting to talk about it. Obviously that was a devastating event in people's lives, a life-changing event in Eastern Idaho. And those of us that are out of that region didn't live it. And we should not be telling them what they did live and what they didn't live and their reaction to it. That's not our place. But there's starting to be talk in Eastern Idaho that that dam needs to be rebuilt. And I agree. I agree 100%. I brought it up early in my legislative career, and I was told by an Eastern Idaho legislator that there had not been enough funerals in Eastern Idaho yet to seriously consider rebuilding that because it was still too fresh of an issue. But that is changing, and I believe that it will be the safest dam that has ever been built when they rebuild it because they do not want to repeat that. So yeah, there are discussions, but yeah, in a federal system like we have and we live under umbrella of federal regulation, including the Endangered Species Act, that dam is not going to be easily built. There's going to be a lot of consultation under the Endangered Species Act to get that to happen, and all of the other regulatory hurdles that we're going to have to address to get that done. But we never will do it if we don't start now. And so that's kind of what's going on.
Last question. If you got to be a water czar for a day, what would be the one big thing you would put in place to protect the future of water for all water users?
I've thought a lot about that. I think there's some components that we're going to have to come to grips with and do. If I'm in the Treasure Valley, for example, and there's this unfettered growth on ground that used to be farmed, then I think that it's proper that we use groundwater and those sources of water inside the house, but everything outside the house should be from the surface water system that used to irrigate the farm that was on that ground where your subdivision is now. I think you've got to have this bifurcation of ground because the groundwater levels in the Treasure Valley are going down, and they're directly affected by the farmers' irrigation activities. And so I think you got to have a culinary system that you don't use outside of the house. But then but we want to have beautiful communities, green communities, and we have plenty of water. So the river water needs to be used outside the house, and groundwater inside the house when it absolutely fits. So that's one thing. That applies but that applies in the rest of the state. That's not just Treasure Valley as well. I think Twin Falls, Idaho has done a really good job in bifurcating the two systems. And we could talk about that, what they've done there. And that's more closely where I live, so I know more about it. So that's one thing. I think we all got to measure all the time, because we're not going to manage your resource. If you never get a bank statement, it's hard to manage your checking account. If you never look at it and you're just going by the seat of your pants, that's not a way you can't manage anything that you're not measuring. So I think everything needs to be strictly managed, and the information on this commonly held asset has got to be available publicly. We're going to look over everybody's shoulders on this stuff, on these assets that we all have part of. Just like we want our government to be completely transparent. I mean, all of these things that we do together as a community, transparency helps, and accurate data helps. So those are two things that I would do if you grant me being a czar, I guess. I think down the road, I think we got to get serious about the interface between the environment and our activities. That running away from the Endangered Species Act all the time and letting that tail wag the dog is, I think, is ultimately going to be folly. We don't have the luxury of doing that and living in the West. We need the water. Idaho is a great place to live because we do the politics right, and that is bringing a whole bunch of people here to Idaho, and they have to have access to clean water. So, if I'm czar, I'm going to renegotiate we're not going to use water coming from the snake system to fix a problem in the Clearwater system. We're not going to use this offsite mitigation stuff. We're going to, but at the same time, I mean, I kind of hear myself say that, and I don't want to see, there would be no salmon, steelhead, and that. But I think we've largely mitigated the returns of those fish through our reservoir systems, and that the problems are out in the ocean, and those are beyond our ability to affect here in Idaho. I mean, you compare the snake, the Payette system or the Clearwater system to the Fraser system. The Fraser system north of us is every bit as big as the Columbia system, and it has no dams on it, and their fish runs are mirror ours. This oceanic issues, not interior issues. Now, we can contribute to that, and we should do our part, but letting that tail wag the whole dog, I would do away with if I were czar, which I'm not. So we're stuck with each other. We're going to have to work it out little at a time, slowly. It's going to be ponderous. We're going to have to be patient with each other. Everybody's issues are going to have to be brought to the table, and we're stuck with working them out in long meetings.
And I appreciate discussing the water issues here, because this is one of those things where it doesn't get talked about enough. There's too much, in my opinion, too much focus on things like culture war issues that, yeah, they're fun to talk about. There's a lot of hype around them, but at the end of the day, it's things like water, right? It impacts all Idahoans. It connects all of us. We're all hydrologically connected in a sense. I want to thank you for coming on this podcast, and I appreciate all the work you do.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. I obviously have immersed myself, no pun intended, in this issue, and it is so critical to our state's future that we've got to be on top of it. I mean, we don't, we go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, if you don't have water, you don't have much to build on here. And, if we want to argue about other things. We better get the underpinnings of our society in place, and that fundamental is water in Idaho.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.